Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Reynolds, Associate Chair for Research and Entrepreneurship in Electrical Engineering. And it's a pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Nathan Kutz, who is the Robert Bowles and Yasuko Endo Professor in Applied Math, and also an adjunct professor both in electrical engineering and in physics. Nathan is a UW alumnus. He was awarded his BS in physics and math from UW in 1990, and then received a PhD in applied math from Northwestern in 1994. He did postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Minnesota and at Princeton, and then joined UW's Department of Applied Math, where he has served as chair until 2015. He's received many awards, both for graduate fellowships and also his research and teaching as a faculty member, including the NSF Career Award, several faculty research fellowships, and he twice received the Applied Math Excellence in Teaching Award. So it's a pleasure to welcome Nathan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm Nathan. I'm over from Applied Math. I know some of you know me because you're taking my classes or have. So my job is to tell you a little bit about some things I've been working on and my group has been working on. So mostly it's going to highlight a lot of the effort of my postdocs and students. That's my hope, is that you can kind of see a little bit of that. Everybody's talking about data and what to do with data. So mostly what I like to do with data is try to think about building physical models with it. I come from a physics engineering background, so I don't want to throw out all my education around engineering and physics, so I'd like to take the data and enhance what I do in my own workflow in some sense. And I'm going to go with the green pointer because this is actually better. So I'm going to talk about discovering equations from data itself, okay? And I'm going to really break this down in sort of a series of vignettes. I'm going to talk a little bit about model discovery, a little bit about thinking about, I call this manifolds embeddings, whatever. You can think about it as just a good coordinate systems. That's one way I would like for you to think about it. And then finally, I'm going to try to think about how can we bring this over to neuroscience type problems. And I'll talk about two neuroscience models in particular, a worm called the C. elegans and a moth called Manduca sexta. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. Okay, so first, audience gets to answer this. Fill in the blank. Biology is messy, yes. I was looking for hard, super messy, really hard. If you put in any other answer, it's wrong. Those are the right answers. Okay, full credit is hard or super hard. You can, okay? Biology, it really is. Because if you're going to try to model these systems, they have so many components and so many levels you can model them on, from chemistry to neurons to cells, and these are extremely complex. But we do collect data around these things. And we'd like to try to build models from that data. So I'll leave that there. And one thing we know for sure is if we're going to go solve really hard problems, we got to bring our top shelf game to the table in the math world. Yeah? So I'm bringing it. And here it is. All right, ax equal to b. You may laugh, but I'm going to tell you that my talk's all about ax equal to b. And I'm going to tell you that ax equal to b, you may think you know ax equal to b just because you can hit backslash on MATLAB. Well, there's a lot more to ax equal to b than meets the eye. And part of that is going to be what this story is about. Okay? So you already know what we need to solve. And I'm not lying when I say almost everything I'm going to do is ax equal to b. Okay? So let's start off with what ax equal to b in data science world actually is. Matrices in the data world are not square. They're not like Math 308, Math 352, or whatever course you took on linear algebra where you're just simply n by n systems. That's not what we're going to be doing. Those are like unicorns and fairies. They don't exist really, not in data world. Data world, they come in this form here, tall, skinny, or short, fat, right? So I maybe have a few sensors, but I record for a very long time, or I have a ton of variables, very few instances. So I either have matrices that are massively overdetermined or massively underdetermined. Now, of course, you may have not thought about that much because you just go, so, backslash. Right? You didn't have to think about what do you mean, backslash? He gave you an answer, right? Did you stop to think about what the answer was? Because in one case, there are no solutions. In the other case, there's infinite, yet it gave you one answer. How did it do that? Okay, so we're going to talk about methods for this. Okay? And the way you can actually solve Ax equal to b in these cases, since there are either infinite number or no solutions, is you say, well, to get the solution I want, I'm going to have to pose a subject to line. And that subject to line allows me then to solve Ax equal to b uniquely. Okay? In a more general framework, you might do this. Solve some nonlinear, instead of Ax equal to b, you solve some nonlinear system of equations with a subject to line. By the way, this is kind of all of machine learning in one slide. In an abstract way, that's all machine learning in one, okay? I'm not lying. It's just that this can be very complicated, but really, it's just that with a subject to line. Okay? All of machine learning is an optimization at the bottom. So whatever anybody else is telling you, something fancier than that, I mean, okay, you tell your parents fancy things, but to your friends here, this is all you're doing. Okay? All right. So with that set up, let's start talking about model discovery. And this is work with Steve Brunton over in mechanical engineering. Maybe you've seen him walking around campus. Josh Proctor, who's at Institute for Disease Modeling. And he was an undergrad. Josh was here. He worked with me as an undergrad. And I went to Princeton, and then he came back, and he's working there at the Institute. And they're very interested in taking data for especially disease and trying to figure out, can we start thinking about models for disease? And so how do we start thinking about getting equations or models for these very complex systems? So here's what we're going to do is we're going to start here. We're going to say, I have some equations. N here represents some nonlinear right-hand side. It could depend on x squared, x cubed, sine x, whatever it happens to be. Mu is usually a parameter. Something in the system changes, the dynamics change, it could bifurcate. There's all kinds of things that can happen. And then I have some measurements. Now here's what we traditionally do. In our textbooks, you're taking a bunch of courses right now, right? Presumably a bunch of you taking electrical engineering courses. And each one of those courses you take, there's a textbook. And in that textbook, they tell you what that is. Maxwell's equations, circuit equations, whatever happens to be. You're told this, and maybe you take some measurements. You say, look, it's all good. Here's what we're going to do instead. I actually don't know what that is. I'm going to measure the system, and I'm going to try to figure out what that n actually is. So for instance, in biology problems, it's really hard to write down first principles models. You don't have, conservation of mass and momentum, little your Pillbach derivations that you do for E&M sitting around, right? You don't have those. You have stuff's happening. Okay? So what we're going to do is, but we can record a lot of information. So the world's changed in a way in the last bit of time. What the big data world's all about really is, I got a lot of this, a lot of measurements. And for us, in our physics-driven world, we want to build that. Okay? Everybody clear what the goal is? Find the dynamics that produce the data. It's a belief that there's an underlying process that actually generated the data in the first place. The data didn't just pop up. We're not looking at Amazon databases. We're looking at physical systems. Something produced that data. What produced that data? So I'm going to give you a way to think about it, which is to say, all right, what could have produced the data? So let's start making up a library of potential right-hand sides. dx dt equals something. What's something? Well, here's some possibilities. I'm going to make up a library of possibilities. It could depend upon a constant, linear terms, quadratic terms, cubic, sines, cosine. I can make up almost anything I want here. It's limited only by my imagination. So I have a whole library of potential right-hand side functions. Okay? Now, for instance, the quadratic terms, if it's an n-dimensional state space, they look like this. These are all the potential quadratics. So each column of this is a potential right-hand side term, and each row is a different time measurement. So I start measuring my system, and I can build this giant matrix. That's the A in AX equal to B. Okay? All right. So let's take a system and try to do it with this. This is what's called the Lorenz Equations over here. It's sort of a very famous equations because it's the first time we really recognized this idea of sensitivity to initial data, chaotic dynamics, things like this. Okay? Early 1960s. Ed Lorenz at MIT wrote this down. They really didn't have very fast computers, and he started to discover these things by doing simulations. So what we're going to do with this thing is we're going to just simulate it. And I'm going to give you x and y and z as a function of time, and your job then is to tell me what was the equation that generated that. Okay, so this is a test case, a toy model for doing this. So what we're going to do is say if I give you x and y and z, then you can compute x dot, y dot, z dot. All right, just differentiate it. All right, so you have a time series, take its time derivative. By the way, do not do finite differences here, because finite differences suck. You have to use something fancier than finite differences if you differentiate. So we do this total rational derivative. Okay? And by the way, bad differentiation is known in scientific computing world. Getting good derivatives of things is really hard. Okay? So this is like a classic problem. So this gives us then this set of vectors here. This is the B vector. So I can construct an A matrix from libraries and fill them in. Here's the B vector. AX equals to B. And what is X? X tells me, it's basically telling me how much of each one of these terms is on. Right? So it's just to say, you know, I got this much of this term, this much of this term. That's what I'm trying to find. Now here is where backslash will kill you. If you backslash this or do a pseudo-inverse, it tries to do a least square fit. And you know what least square fit does? It tries to minimize the least square error, which means it takes the differences and squares them. So you know what it's trying to do is trying to make everything as small as possible, because if you have a very small number and you square it, it becomes even smaller. So its goal is to make all these numbers as small as possible. So if you just do the backslash, it'll say every single library element matters just a little bit. That's clearly not the right model. Instead, we do AX equal to B, and instead, we promote sparsity here. And there's many ways to do this, but you can use the L1 norm. So more and more people are thinking about the L1 norm. It's a proxy for sparsity. So I just solve AX equal to B, subject to the solution having a small L1 norm. And what that's going to do is try to make most of those coefficients 0. And in fact, what I've shown you here is when we do this, those are the ones that are non-zero. And if I look at the coefficients that are non-zero, they're over here. You can't read them off very well. They're exactly these terms. So I gave you x and y and z, just time series data, and just said, you know, the governing equation for that is this. So I was able to do it. I took the data, reconstructed the dynamics from it. Okay? So why is this important? Well, this is a little bit of a difference between Kepler and Newton. Kepler wrote down, he had Tycho Brahe's data. Okay, so Tycho Brahe died. He never shared his data. He was not one of these open source guys. He just said, I'm going to keep this until I die. Well, that's exactly what he did, and then he died. Kepler got his data, and 11 years later, he wrote his famous book, and he showed that orbits were, in fact, elliptical. You know what I think it took 11 years to do is take all that data and do a regression to an ellipse. Okay, because that's actually what he did. And he wrote down his elliptical laws and so forth. So this was important. But he can now tell you about that data. But what Newton did by writing down F equals ma, when you write down F equals ma, the solutions to those equations are just Kepler's elliptic orbits. So you could say, what's the big deal about Newton? Well, the big deal about Newton is now you have a governing set of equations. And one thing that Kepler couldn't do, he couldn't tell you how to launch a rocket and put a person on the moon. But once you know F equals ma, you can do things you've never seen. It generalizes. And so getting the governing equations is really critical. Everybody good with that? You look super excited. Okay. Yes. Noise. Oh, good question. Next slide. Okay, noise. Exactly. So we can handle some noise. So a little bit of noise is tolerable. The biggest difficulty from noise point of view is computing good derivatives in time. Because once I start loading noise onto this thing, then having that total variational differentiation becomes really critical. So I still discover the Lorenz attractor equations with this noise. But if I keep loading noise on, if you've not, okay, here's one thing. If you've learned nothing else in electrical engineering, is you add enough noise, it will destroy you. Okay, right? That's it. That's like a theorem. Noise kills if it's big enough. It's not clear what the line is, but that's going to happen. Same thing here. We can handle some, not as much. However, we haven't really applied a lot of what you might think about signal processing and denoising techniques at all, right? Which electrical engineers are very good at. Let's do a harder problem. Flow around the cylinder. So you may not care about flow around the cylinder, but in grad school, this is what I learned about in applied math. Fluid flow. Look, flow around the cylinder. And I decided right then and there, it's like, I'm not doing fluids, because they seem to get super excited about this. And I didn't have it in me to get super excited about fluid flow. But I'm going to do it here. And what it is, you take a cylinder, flow comes this way, and you get vortex shedding. Okay? And some people really get excited about that. And so what we did with this is said, okay, let's take this case. And this is very high dimensional, because this is now a simulation with x and y positions. So if we do this simulation, it's got potentially a 1,000,000 degree of freedom system. So what we do with this is we take snapshots of the system, and we look for low-rank structure in that data. So in other words, we do an SVD, PCA, POD, whatever you want to call it. We look for correlative structures, and it turns out there's 3 dominant modes. Here they are, mode 1, 2, 3. Those dominate the dynamics. And then what we do is say, well, okay, those 3 modes dominate, and if you look at your SVD, the V matrix tells you what each of these modes is doing in time. And then what we do is build a model for that. And after we just do our regression, I said, solve AX equal to B, and you get this set of equations here. Now, these set of equations actually are very interesting. They're actually the normal form set of equations for this vortex shedding system. And this was derived after a 32-year period, actually. So in 1971, these guys said, well, look, this seems to be this thing called a Hopf bifurcations, where periodic structure develops. But it was very confusing because the normal form, or the typical way this happens, is through a cubic nonlinearity, but the Navier-Stokes equations, which governs the fluid flow, was quadratic. So how does a quadratic produce the cubic? 1971, 2003. That's the gap where they figured this out finally. We got it just by measuring, tell you what the equations are. So it's kind of nice, right? So it's discovering sort of the underlying model, the nonlinear dynamics that represents the physics of that flow. Okay? Yes? What's that? Mean field flow? Oh, so in some sense, what they did here, so all this means mean field is kind of this reduction into this 3-dimensional space. Right, so it's a high-dimensional system, but then when you reduce it down into this low-dimensional subspace, it's a 3-dimensional system, and that's called the mean field model. All right, so this what this is telling you now is then you could say, hey, I have a principled method, which is just AX equal to B, to go discover physics just from measurements. All right, let's do a little bit harder problems. This is with Sam Rudy. He's a PhD student over in applied math. And then we started saying, okay, the PDEs, partial differential equations. So what I've shown you before is just differential equations. Now we say, okay, now let's do this fluid flow example again, where I take full state measurements. And in fact, I can do the same thing, but now instead of in my library having just terms, I can now have terms that have spatial derivatives associated with them. So I have space and time derivatives involved. Okay? So that becomes important because there's diffusion processes, there's dispersion processes. These are things that are spatially dependent. And I could do the same thing. Library, I have omega, which is the vorticity. I can compute, this is AX equal to B. It's just a lot bigger, AX equal to B. And what I do is if I go through this regression problem, promote sparsity, I get the Navier-Stokes equation. Okay, so obviously you were not impressed, but this is like kind of miraculous. You just measure fluid flow and you discovered Navier-Stokes. I'll pretend you're super excited about that, because we were, because this is kind of a remarkable thing, right? The Navier-Stokes took a long time for people to figure this out. You do conservation of mass and momentum, derive this fluid equation. It's a very famous equation, and here you just measure for time, tell me that there's Navier-Stokes there. That's remarkable. So it captures and intends many of the things that are underlying it, including conservation of mass and momentum and these things, okay? Now, I did tell you it goes much bigger because this is a really big scale problem because this is like 1,000,000 degrees of freedom, so building this library is huge. But I also know it's a low rank underneath it. In other words, there's low rank structures that dominate, which means I can massively subsample the data in spatial patches. Why spatial patches? Because I still need to compute derivatives. So I can do that in a patch. So to compute a spatial derivative, I need my neighbors. Okay? And if you do that, I can make a much, much smaller problem, do the regression, get back Navier-Stokes. Okay? So this is going to be important, especially as we start thinking about biology, because what people are very interested in now is large-scale recordings of biological systems, right? You can do whole brain imaging. You can do fMRI imaging. So this is massive spatial structures and time dynamics. And so we want to start thinking about using these techniques like this on that. Let me finish this off by just listing all the canonical models that we just kind of we can discover with this. These are sort of the ones we came up with, which are we can put up, do things with Korteweg, De Vries, Berger, Schrodinger, NLS, KS, this Kuramoto-Shevchinski, reaction diffusion, Navier-Stokes. We can discover them all. So if you're in applied math, this is sort of your canon of nonlinear PDEs to discover. Okay? So we can get them all. And they all have different tolerances to noise. And, but it's remarkably works remarkably well. Now, the question I always get is, yeah, but like, how do you know you have the right-hand side? You made up some polynomials on some derivatives. What I'm going to claim here is, look at these form of equations. These have been really dominant in the physics literature, in engineering literature. And they're all polynomials and simple derivatives. We can make harder things. But it seems, the way I like to cast this is, what we discover is dominant balance dynamics. Systems are obviously much more complex, but what we discover is sort of the dominant physical balance of terms, which often, or it seems to be just generically the case, to be polynomials and simple derivatives. Yes?
How sure are you that you don't make a mistake?
Oh, great. So good question. Just like in most data science, what you would do is you do a cross-validation task. So I would build the model from doing the regression. And of course, I'd hold some of the data out, right, that never saw my regression. And then I would say, now go test it on this new data and see if it's self-consistent with that new data. If you have a bad model, it announces itself to you very quickly on that data. It says, yeah, actually, these don't have anything to do with each other. Okay, so the cross-validation is huge in this. So you find a model, regress towards this, and then you can come over, test it on something else. That's one way. The other way you can do is compute sort of model selection criteria such as BIC, AIC. These are Bayesian information criteria, or Akaike information criteria. These are both two ways to compute how good your model is. Okay? So, you can also handle parametric dependencies. What if one of the parameters is changing in time? So here, this is the Burger's equation, and it has this time-dependent, this is a nonlinear advection term, and it's changing in time. Now, this is really difficult if you just do the regression I told you before, because it's trying to get fixed parameters, and if something's moving on it, it doesn't know how to handle it. So what we do is say, all right, this is problematic, so I want to have parametric dependency. By the way, here's the simulation. Oh, I should also mention, everything I've shown you, all the code can be downloaded off my website. The first stuff on different equations, you just go there, there's a little MATLAB package. The PD stuff, there's a little Python notebook. Download it, you can run it right now. I won't even, see, some of you got laptops open, you could like be doing work right now instead of checking email. Okay, except I'm sure your email is super important, just like mine. If we're going to handle that case, what we're going to do is going to generalize this idea of sparse thresholding to include what's called group sparsity thresholding. And you can either do it through what's called group lasso, or what we do, which is sequential group least square thresholding. It's just another way to promote sparsity. And what you're really just saying is, look, the sparsity pattern, in other words, the terms I should be selecting should be the same for different patches of the data, but the weighting can change in time. Right? Just like that coefficient was 1/4 sine t, it's changing in time. So if we do this, if you just do least squares, awful. If you do lasso, or group lasso, doesn't do so hot. Our method kind of nails it. So it picks out that sign variation as well as the constant term. So it says, look, I got the right terms. So I disambiguated what is the actual model from what is the parametric dependency, and I pulled them apart. That becomes very important because in most systems, if you do not account for parametric variation, you're in trouble. Okay? By the way, MacGyver time. Do you guys know MacGyver? Okay, so maybe none of you were born when he was around, but he was awesome. Like he could just take, okay, from this podium, I could build a truck or whatever you want. Just tell me what you want me to build with this. I could build it with just like a TV screen and water bottles. Okay? That's what MacGyver was like. In every episode, he built something awesome. So this is that's the relationship to this awesome experiment I'll show you. Check it out. Cinder blocks, linoleum floor. You know that stuff you can throw your pen through? Okay, and we're going to do an experiment, and here's our experiment. Boom. 2 pendula. Whip it around. We just bolted this into the wall. And here's the question. We're going to take real data. And here's some example profiles of this real data. And what you're not seeing here is that fact that we attached an Arduino to the bottom of this thing. Okay? So this is work with Taryn Gorman, who just graduated. So he basically built this setup. He did it over right across the street in the ME lab. And he said, okay, let's take the accelerometer readings. Just like if you were to attach your cell phone to this thing too. Just take the cell phone accelerometer readings as this thing is going around. And can we, in fact, we can look at the trajectories. Here they are. And then the question is, can we discover the equations of the pendulum? And in fact, here's some Python code. There it is. Has some, you know, I even show you the full thing. Like I didn't even bother to clean it up. Like, you know, some warnings and divide by zeros, problems. It doesn't affect the result, actually. But what I want to point out to you is this here. Here's the answer. dx0 dt is equal to x1. dx1 dt is some small number, x1, plus negative sine x0. This is the nonlinear pendulum with damping. Got it right out of the data, right out of this regression. It works on real data, right? So, I mean, okay, this is the level of experiment we do over in applied math. You might do something fancier. But the point is, it should work here, and it does, okay? So you do this regression, you get out the pendulum. All right, now here's what's interesting. If you looked at that data, I had a couple of pendulums that went all the way around. If I just have a bunch of swings that are kind of big, and they don't go all the way over the top, it will actually just give you an x cubed here, which is the Taylor series expansion of the pendulum. Okay? And it's kind of interesting, right? So it says, look, cubic works really well for you. Use it. As soon as it sees it go over the top, it says, cubic can't do that, which it can't. So it gives you the sign. Okay? All right, so this is one way to go about your business. I'm very much a proponent of you better have a lot of different angles of attack, especially when it comes to biology. Because if you commit to a method, you're going to lose. Biology will just take you out completely. It's going to do it anyway, but you got a better chance of fighting if you've got a couple methods going for you. So the other thing I want to talk about is the idea of manifolds and embeddings. In particular, thinking about taking measurements of a system. And let me make just the following point. Just because you measured it doesn't make it the right variable. Okay? Just because you may just have measured something, it's not the right variable, necessarily. So Bernard Koopman, goes all the way back to 31, had this idea. We're going to talk about this idea of Koopman embeddings. What he said is, I can take a finite dimensional nonlinear differential equation, and I can basically take it up into an infinite dimensional function space through some function g, where this nonlinear system becomes infinite dimensional. Okay? It's a theorem. Now, or a definition. So basic idea, nonlinear differential equation, define some new coordinate system y, which is g of x, this thing becomes linear. So it seems like such a nice idea. But how do you get that g? Now, Bernard, back then, did not have a computer, so he was a little bit stuck. And so this stayed in this problem space for a long time, so 1931. It gets picked back up around 2005 by Igor Mezic down at Santa Barbara. And then we start developing techniques, and this is something that Steve and I have been working on, is to think about how do I get that G? That's the thing that matters to me. Now let me tell you that you already know about Koopman a little bit, maybe. Okay, so normally I give a talk to an applied math crowd, so they care more about, like, let's say, the Burger's equation, and maybe you don't care about Burger's equation. But let me tell you about Burger's. There it is. It's a nonlinear PDE. Why it's important is this term here produces nonlinear wave propagation, which will create shocks. This diffusion term regularizes the shock. It's like famous if you do fluids. Okay. Remember, I didn't want to do fluids, but here I am talking about it. What's interesting is it's a really hard problem to solve. It's nonlinear, and there's no generic methods for nonlinear system, nonlinear PDEs or ODEs. But there's a transform known as the Cole-Hoff. Around 1950 and 51, Cole and Hoff independently said, hey, look, if I move from u to the variable v, this thing becomes the heat equation. I know how to solve a heat equation. It's super easy. I can solve it like on paper. I don't even need a computer. I can write down analytically a solution for it. So I think the moral of the story in showing you this Burger's equation is that this thing here in a new variable system is linear, and that's what I'm looking for. I want to take my nonlinear dynamics, put it in a new coordinate system where the whole thing is linear, as much as possible. So here's a model of the nonlinear Schrodinger equation. This actually measures nonlinear pulse propagation in optical fibers and waveguides. And here is a simulation result, and here is a reconstruction using these new set of observables. And there's this method called the dynamic mode decomposition, which actually computes this Koopman operator. And so if you do the observable as g of x is equal to x, you get this. If I use this set of observables, I get this nice reproduction. They look kind of similar, but I'm going to show you this here is like within 10 to the minus 5 of that. This is within 10 to the minus 1, so it's 4 orders of magnitude better. This one here, I use the wrong observables, and I get something awful. So the choice of observables matters. And my choice of here was just motivated by, look, I got that, so let's put that in as an observable. And what I essentially did is this thing lives in some nonlinear space, and I just flattened it out. with a good set of observables. I didn't make it perfectly flat, but I made it mostly flat. And so I can do perturbation theory on that now. And here are the area measurements, but you can see this is like, my simulation originally was down at 10 to the minus 5 and 6, and that one observable here, I'm almost at numerical round off. The other one here is, it's not bad. It's 10 to the minus 1, so there's 4 decades of difference, and that one here is big error. So it just tells you there could be a good embedding. And so we started thinking about how do we generalize these concepts, and we started, let's go to some deep neural nets and think about doing that. I've been typically very tempted not to work with deep neural nets. The reason is I hate the fact that I lose interpretability of things. You just train a deep neural net to do stuff, and you don't know why it did it. I want to know why my things work. So what we said is, how about if we train a deep neural net with a purpose, which is, I want to take my input space, find the correct variables, so that in this new variable, things are going to be linear. But notice what I've done. This is an autoencoder format where this is low dimensional. And then I can come back out. So there's a lot of work recently on this. Look at that. All 2017 papers, all doing deep learning, but they tend to project up into just some super high dimensional space and say, look how good my predictions are. And there's really no interpretability left, although they have good predictions. What we want to do is say, let's pinch down so I get something that has physical interpretability. So we can train this neural net by enforcing a few things, that going from x of k to y of x of k plus 1 has to satisfy this, and going to y of k plus 1 is you can either come from here or you come from here. They should be all equivalent. So you can just train a deep neural net using something like TensorFlow. Just download for free, run it, train it. So what's the model we want to run it on? Well, one other thing before I say that. In addition to this training, we were stuck for quite a long time. And it turns out the reason we were stuck is that there's something really simple that happens in dynamical systems. When you get larger, for instance, as you start moving away and making things nonlinear, often what happens is if you have an underlying frequency, it shifts due to the nonlinearity. This has been well known since forever. People working on the nonlinear pendulum realized x cubed was the next correction term, and they knew it shifted the frequency. If your deep neural net doesn't account for that, it tries to build you an infinite series expansion, essentially, in the underlying frequency. We said, let's parametrize, then, our thing by a frequency. So we have this network that builds a parametric dependency so that when you crush it down to the underlying intrinsic rank of the dynamics, which is, let's say, for us, it's going to be 2 because we're going to look at a pendulum, that the dynamics here, the linear dynamics, is parametrized by frequency. And if we do that, we can get a very nice result, which tells you that I can take the entire space of the pendulum, which is highly nonlinear. In other words, you get to bigger and bigger oscillations. Your frequency shifts, your oscillations change shape. And I can take this whole thing, project onto these two discovered eigenfunctions, and everything is linear on that space. It's parametrized by that frequency. So I took the pendulum and I made it linear, not just here, but all the way out to here. Linear. I got great predictions. Okay? So that's the idea behind finding a better coordinate system. There's your better coordinate system. It's a very different approach. Notice what we did is we said, if I go to this coordinate system, everything's linear. So I'm not trying to find nonlinear dynamics. I'm trying to find a space instead, right? The first one I was just trying to find a nonlinear dynamics. This one I'm trying to find a space where everything's linear. Two different approaches. Okay. Let's skip that. All right, so what are we going to do with all this? So, yes?
The Koopman embedding could be in general to a larger dimensional space.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, in general, most people think about Koopman to embedding to an infinite dimensional space. And so you could do this, so you can train networks to do it. And what we were trying to say is, well, that's fine, and people do it. But what we wanted to say is, I know my pendulum is two-dimensional. So I could go up into this massively high-dimensional space, but knowing that, I should be able to bring it, there's some coordinate system where it should still be two-dimensional. Right? Look, you do a lot of dumb things in life, and my whole educational system was like about perturbation theory, and it took me forever, like half a year, to figure out that like, oh, I got to take account of the frequency. I think my advisor would have been embarrassed about me. Is this on tape? Okay. Anyway, maybe he won't find this. But anyway, that was a problem. So as soon as we figured that out, that's what allowed us to go back down to the intrinsic rank of the dynamics, this parametrization. Yes?
We know that the duality to the Kuban operator is called the paraphobious operator. And my question is, what is the advantage of Kuban operator when you apply and you do lots of multiplication?
What's the advantage of the Koopman operator? So if I want to give you a future state prediction, I want you to say, give me, go to the future, 10 time units. I just multiply by matrix, K, raised to some power. I can give you very quick future state predictions because the K tells me exactly the linear mapping of how going from time t to t plus delta t. So that's the big advantage, is I have this explicit representation of how how the flow of the dynamics is moving. It's not some nonlinear map. It's a linear map in that space.
And this is not paraphobious.
No. Okay, so now we want to come to here and start talking about biology, because biology is where we want to apply this to. Now, here's the disappointing part of the talk. We've started building the machinery, and we're going to go towards this, but I'm going to tell you that we don't have a whole lot of results up here yet. So this is still part of the thing. Why don't we have a lot of results? First of all, getting data is hard. You go to talk to a biologist, yeah, we've been taking, like, can I get some data? Yeah, we're going to get that done. A year goes by. Here's an advice for you. If you're talking to biologists, make sure you get data that they already have, not that they're going to get, because it could take 2 years, 10, whatever. You don't know. Just ask, what do you actually have, like, in a file already that you think is throwaway data? Give me that. I'll start working with that. Okay? Seriously, that's good advice. Did anybody write that down? Nobody? Okay. All right. But here's what's cool about biology. This is the antenna lobe of a locust. These are neurons sitting around here, and they can record from this. This is about 10 to the 6 neurons in there. And here's some of the activity that happens. These are spikes. So you give it an odor, it gets spikes out. And nobody really quite knows what a spike means. So what we do is just say, well, let's just look at average firing rate activity. And so we can smooth it out. And what you find is if you do that, you take all this data and you just do PCA on it, and you project onto the first 3 principal components, lo and behold, you get this kind of structure. So you're here, and you apply odor, it goes up to here. You take the odor away, it goes to there. This is a 10 to the 6 dimensional system of neurons that are behaving effectively, collectively, on 3 degrees of freedom. This is our great hope for us in what we want to do, because, hey, I think I have a shot at that, right? And somehow all these biological systems have this underlying that, yeah, it's super high dimensional, but everything's being processed in some collective low dimensional way. So we started thinking about building codes here, and this is work with Jeff Riffle over in biology, Ellie Schleiserman, who's here in EE and applied math. And we started saying, well, we can start then thinking about doing data-driven projections onto these low-dimensional modes. If you find some dominant mode activity, which you do in the data, you say, well, let's build models for it here. And we've been able to do this, and originally what we did is we enforced what the model was. We said, well, let's just say that the A of T dynamics lives on a firing rate model. And we can do a projection onto that space where these are sort of your modes that you find from the data. So you take advantage of your data to build the right embedding, and then you project onto there. More broadly, it kind of looks like this as a network structure. There's an input and an output. You come into an input layer, you go through a network, and you have readout neurons. That's the abstraction of this thing, and then you can start building models on that. And when you start doing that, you start seeing things like, oh, look at this, experiment theory give you very nice matches. So you give it odor A or odor B, and odor A it goes this way, odor B it goes this way. And these are theory, but you can see experiment and theory matched up for these things. Experiments are also really noisy in biology, right? So that's another tricky thing about biological experiments. There's a lot of variability. And even when they measure, right, when we get these measurements, they take them off and they just stick forks in them in this antennal lobe. So it's not like you're hitting the same neurons that you did in the moth, Bob the moth and Mike the moth and Jenny the moth. They're all different. You're recording from different things, but you aggregate it all together to try to build something reasonable out of it. More recently, we've started looking at this, and this is with Charles de la Hunt. This paper will go up very soon. We started looking at learning in the moth. And it turns out there's this interesting structure. The odor comes into the antennal lobe. That's what we had built a model of previously. But then it goes into the mushroom body, or the brain. And the question is, how does it learn new codes? And it turns out there's this interesting process that if you look at the antennal lobe, and if you give it, during learning, you give it octopamine, which basically increases overall excitation of the neurons in the antennal lobe, it will actually rewire the mushroom body so that now something that it didn't respond to before, now it responds to after. And after only 4 or 5 trials. Like it gives a whiff of odor, builds a code. It's quite remarkable. It's the antithesis of a deep neural net. If you're going to train for a new object in a deep neural net, the back of the envelope calculation is you need about 5,000 of that object. So if I want to train a deep neural net that I have trained to see pictures, to recognize a white Toyota truck, I need about 5,000 pictures. This says 1, and I can actually, so also in the computer vision, they want 99.999% accuracy. Here, you're not really going for that. You have a really noisy environment. You want one shot, and it gets at 75% with one example. If it got rewarded with one example, it can build this very quickly. And here's the kind of the architecture of this thing. You have this network talking to this network, producing a perceptron layer. And if you hit it with a reward, this guy here rewires that guy there, and then it goes back to its regular state. But it builds a new code over there on the perceptron. Okay? Some final thoughts around this is that I think of the opposite of learning as being damage. And the damage that I think about is neurodegenerative diseases, traumatic brain injuries. So, and even aging, that's what's happening to me, is neurons just die, okay? But before they die, they swell up, and then they die, okay? So all these neurodegenerative diseases, this is actually Alzheimer's. You have swellings, multiple sclerosis, swellings. Remember, spikes were traveling through here. Spikes somehow carried information. And when this thing happens, these swellings, it's not clear what's happening anymore. So we went back and said, well, let's go back to the cable equations of neuroscience to talk about how spikes propagate. And from there, we were able to build a model for how they go through geometrical structures and how spike trains get compromised. And if spike trains get compromised, we can build maps like this. They're very intuitive, which this is like our traffic map. These are neurons that have swellings. And wherever you see red, traffic jam. This is where neurons just pile up and you delete them. What happens if you delete spikes? Well, you lose some kind of information. Like I said, we don't know exactly how much information you're losing, but we just know that these spots in these different neurons, and these are actual real recordings, and we were inspired by your standard Google map, traffic map. Does everybody drive with these? Right? You pull up your phone, you look at your route, you just drive on green streets if you can. Sometimes you're forced to drive on a red. Sometimes your phone doesn't update in time, and you're already committed to be on the freeway, and it's a giant red spot, and it's awful because you can't back up off the ramp, right? Okay, nobody's had that? Happens to me all the time. All right. And so we can start thinking about all these experiments that take statistics on swellings. And so we take these statistics on swellings, we can run them through our propagation model to start understanding what happens to these spikes. And these are essentially real data telling us what happened during injury. And what they do is they take a mouse, drop a weight on its head, calculate swellings, and we can basically say how many of our neurons are going to be affected by this, and then what's going to happen to the total information through there. Let me just go to this chart here. And what it does is something very interesting. it gives us a model for how we make decisions. And so we take this for a decision model, and we say, OK, under injury or neurodegenerative disease, how are you making decisions? Because decisions presumably are based on the spike trains. And so if you start losing spikes, it's kind of actually very interesting. You can sometimes make mistakes in your integration of evidence. So you take all this information in, you give a stimulus, and you misclassify it. But really what we find is you don't suffer so much from accuracy as you do from a very slow decision time. Okay? So, all right, I'm sure many of you have not been drunk because, you know, anybody who's under 21 is never drinking. But if you're drunk, have you noticed, it's not like you don't recognize your friends. It's just you kind of move a little slower at things. Have you noticed this? You think slower. You're like in a time warp. Okay? That's kind of what happens with these neurons when they swell. It's not that you are actually making bad decisions about, like, do I recognize a dog or a cat? It just takes you, instead of 0.2 seconds, it's like, oh, that's a dog. 2 seconds. Okay? This is what happens that we see, is that you have delayed decision making under neurodegeneration and traumatic brain injury. If you've ever been hit in the head, suffered a concussion, you're just really slow at integrating the evidence around you. And this is kind of what this model does. Okay? It's not like we built it in. So I want to finish off here because there are some more things here, but we can also do things like, I'll just finish here because I was going to show you a damaged worm. We can basically take all these dynamics on the worm and make it move, and you can see the damaged worm has a really wonky swim to it, crawling action. Okay? So let me finish off here by saying, what's our ultimate goal? Our ultimate goal in biology is a couple things. First, we'd like to discover some dynamics. These are network systems, lots of data coming in. And actually, our ultimate goal is to do control. Right? Why do we want to do control? Well, there's a lot of rehabilitative medicine that's really going to rely on being able to interface with the brain to do control. So we have to understand how to build models that are good to do this, control models. So here's like this generic picture, which is we're going to stimulate the brain. We're going to get sparse recordings. Part of our deal here is to start building a control model out of this. We're going to take this data and do a lot of what we did earlier. We're going to try to build a nonlinear model or build a linear embedding or both. One of the great things about building a linear embedding, and why would we want to do Koopman? Because once you get x dot equals ax plus bu can come on there. So you know how to do control now. And all of control theory is really based on linear dynamics. There's no general rules for nonlinear dynamics. So our entire objective is project into this linear space or discover the model so that we can project in a linear space so that we might be able to do some kind of things here. And that's my coffee cup. So by the way, I want to brag that it's not on my webpage, but I'm like a semi-pro barista. Okay, at least I got some reaction. Such a quiet crowd. But yeah, see, there's a picture. I'll put more up. I don't have an Instagram account, but if I did, I'd just be picturing of coffee all the time. That's all I got to say today. Thank you guys for coming.
So we have time for a couple questions. I know people asked along the way, but any questions?
Yeah.
What do neurobiologists think about this work right here, modeling the brain?
So we're starting to work with people now. You know, it's interesting it's a great question for a couple reasons. One is that what we have found, people tend to have their ways they like to model things, and it's really hard to get them to shift out of that. So if you look at the computational neuroscience literature, they have a variety of models that they kind of are their go-to, right? And they're very skeptical of anything outside of that. And the hardest part for us has been getting really good data sets for us to sort of say, look how this can work for you. We have some limited success, and what will happen over time is we'll break that down, I hope. Let me give you the other example of this, which is I also do work on lasers still. And for lasers, we've taken some of this machine learning architecture and built a self-tuning laser. Just an algorithm on top that the laser can figure itself out and say, look, I know how I work. I can optimize myself. And what's really interesting about this is the community that builds lasers, yeah, but we do, we model this thing. We know the physics. It's like, here's my prediction. We're going to have a self-driving car before we have a self-tuning laser. And the self-tuning laser only has 5 knobs. And it's partly the stubbornness of this community that they think they know it all. And you see this a little bit in theoretical neuroscience. They're pretty stubborn, arrogant crowd. I don't mean that, okay, maybe it is negative. I do mean that negatively. Don't be one of these people. Don't be arrogant, stuffy, I'm not saying that all these methods work on everything, but I find people to be more closed off than I'm surprised, right? No, we're going to stick with our models. And especially when you say, look, you can just download the code. It's not like I'm asking you to spend a month building code to do this. This is like, just download it, put it on your data. It's not that hard. I'm asking for a day or 2 of your time, not even your time, your grad school, just download, run it. Anyway, uphill battle, but I'm fighting it. Go uphill, both ways.
I think that describes a lot of science and engineering. Yeah, not just biologists.
Yeah, there's a famous saying, science progresses one funeral at a time. It's totally true. After a while, you realize that's actually really true. Got to wait till these guys die. All right, and then eventually somebody say that about me. It's like that guy Nathan. Once he's dead, we'll be able to move forward. So,
great. If there are not any other questions, let's thank Nathan very much. It was a really fun talk. Thank you.